April 10, 1912. The RMS Titanic, hailed as the grandest ship of its time, set sail from Southampton, England, on its maiden voyage. 4 days later, it would be at the bottom of the Atlantic, taking more than 1,500 lives with it. But as the wreck lies silent beneath miles of water, whispers of conspiracy continue to rise to the surface. What really happened that night? Our first conspiracy takes us to an eerie question, one that shakes the very foundation of the Titanic tragedy. Was it truly the Titanic that sank in the Atlantic that night? Or was the world deceived by a grand and calculated switch? Let's take a closer look. The Titanic, famously dubbed unsinkable, had a nearly identical sister ship, the RMS Olympic. The Olympic was the first of the two White Star Line ocean liners to set sail. Built side by side, these two ships were almost indistinguishable from each other in size, design, and grandeur. But while the Titanic is known today for its tragic end, the Olympic has a different story. It faced a series of unfortunate incidents, and some say, a costly fate. Just a year before the Titanic's fateful voyage, the Olympic suffered a serious accident. In September 1911, while navigating waters off the coast of the Isle of Wight, it collided with a British warship, the HMS Hawke. The collision left the Olympic badly damaged, requiring extensive and costly repairs. For the White Star Line, this was a significant financial blow. The Olympic had barely begun its service, and already it was draining the company's resources. And here's where the conspiracy begins. According to some theorists, the White Star Line was in serious financial trouble. Repairing the Olympic was costly, and the ship's insurance coverage wasn't enough to offset those expenses. But the Titanic, their brand new, highly publicized, unsinkable ship, was insured for an enormous sum. This is where it's believed that the White Star Line came up with a bold yet sinister plan. Imagine this. What if they deliberately swapped the two ships? By disguising the damaged Olympic as the Titanic, White Star Line could send it out on the Titanic's maiden voyage. If the ship met with disaster, they could claim the massive insurance payout on the Titanic and cut their losses on the failing Olympic. But was this even possible? Well, there were subtle design differences between the two ships, slight variations that could have given away the deception. One of these differences was in the internal fittings and the porthole arrangements. For example, the Titanic originally had 14 evenly spaced portholes on one side of its bow, while the Olympic had 16, positioned unevenly. However, when the Titanic left Southampton on its maiden voyage, it reportedly had 16 portholes on its bow, an unexpected feature more characteristic of the Olympic. And this wasn't the only discrepancy. Some eyewitnesses noted that certain internal fittings and layout details inside the ship more closely matched the Olympic's design than the original Titanic's. If the ship that set sail that night was indeed the Olympic, it would explain these inconsistencies. But why would White Star Line take such a drastic step? The answer may lie in their financial desperation. After spending a fortune on the Olympic's repairs, White Star Line was looking at the Titanic as a potential financial savior. By sacrificing what was actually the Olympic, disguised as the Titanic, the company could collect an enormous insurance payout. This insurance money would help cover the losses from the Olympic's multiple repairs and allow the company to avoid bankruptcy. But to pull this off, the plan would have needed to be airtight, and they would have needed to ensure that certain people stayed off the ship. Now, let's talk about the passengers. Some of the most influential people who were originally scheduled to be on the Titanic canceled their tickets at the last minute. One of the most notable among them was J.P. Morgan, the powerful financier and the man behind the White Star Line itself. Morgan was one of the ship's biggest backers, and he had reserved a luxurious suite for the Titanic's maiden voyage. But just days before the Titanic set sail, he abruptly canceled his trip, citing health reasons. Oddly enough, Morgan was spotted soon afterward, perfectly healthy, enjoying a spa vacation in France. And Morgan wasn't the only one. There were other notable passengers who also changed their plans at the last minute, including industrialist Henry Clay Frick, who had close ties with Morgan. They too had tickets but decided, for for one reason or another, not to board. The timing of these cancellations is suspicious, to say the least. Did these powerful men know something that the other passengers didn't? The passengers who did board that night were unaware of any deception. For them, this was the trip of a lifetime, a chance to cross the Atlantic on the world's most luxurious liner. Yet, if the ship they boarded was actually the Olympic, what they thought was a historic journey turned into an impending tragedy. To this day, some believe that the White Star Line was willing to risk thousands of lives for a massive insurance payout, using the switch to stage one of the largest deceptions in maritime history. The wreck itself has only fueled this theory. Decades after the Titanic sank, when explorers first found the ship's resting place on the ocean floor, they noticed details that raised more questions. Certain markings, fittings, and damage patterns seemed inconsistent with the Titanic's documented design, sparking a fresh wave of speculation about the true identity of the wreck. Was it indeed the Titanic lying at the bottom of the Atlantic, or was it the Olympic all along? If it wasn't the Titanic, then who was really responsible for the tragedy? How far did White Star Line go to keep this switch a secret? And perhaps the biggest question of all, if it truly wasn't the Titanic, then how deep does this conspiracy go? When we talk about the Titanic, we often think about the ship itself, the marvel of engineering, the glamour, the ill-fated iceberg. But lurking beneath this tragic tale is a story about power, money, and ambition. And at the center of it all, a man named J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was no ordinary businessman. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world and one of the most influential figures in finance. This American banker wielded unprecedented control over banks, railroads, and industries, practically shaping the American economy with his own two hands. And with such power, he had visions of an even greater achievement: the creation of a centralized banking system in the United States, a vision that would ultimately lead to the establishment of the Federal Reserve. But establishing a central bank wasn't going to be easy. At the time, America was divided on the idea. Some saw it as essential for financial stability, while others viewed it as a dangerous consolidation of power, a threat to freedom and democracy. Among those opposed to Morgan's ambitions were some of the wealthiest and most influential men of the time, men who saw Morgan's plans as a threat to their own empires. Morgan was the man behind the Titanic's parent company, the White Star Line. He wasn't just a distant investor, he was the driving force behind the Titanic's grand vision. This was no ordinary ship. This was the unsinkable Titanic, a floating palace designed to showcase his power and influence. And naturally, he had a personal suite reserved on the ship's maiden voyage. But as the Titanic prepared to set sail, something strange happened. Despite being one of the Titanic's biggest backers, Morgan canceled his trip at the last minute. His excuse: poor health, he claimed. It seemed plausible. Morgan was in his 70s by then and could have had legitimate health concerns. But here's where it gets strange. Just days later, eyewitnesses spotted him relaxing in France, not recuperating in bed, but enjoying the luxurious amenities of a French spa. So, why did Morgan, one of the richest men in the world and the man behind the Titanic itself, suddenly decide not to board? Was it really poor health, or did he know something others didn't? Now, let's look at the passenger list. On board the Titanic that night were some of J.P. Morgan's most formidable business rivals. These were no ordinary men. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining tycoon, John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men in America, and Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store. All three were industrial giants with empires and influence that could rival even Morgan himself. And, interestingly, all three were also outspoken opponents of Morgan's plans for a central bank. Guggenheim, Astor, and Straus had made their fortunes in mining, real estate, and retail. They were champions of free enterprise and were deeply skeptical of centralized control over banking. They feared that a centralized bank would give Morgan too much power, allowing him to manipulate interest rates and control the economy in his favor. These men weren't just wealthy. They were powerful, influential, and well-connected. If there was anyone who could stand in Morgan's way, it was them. As the Titanic left Southampton, these men boarded the ship, likely without any suspicion of what lay ahead. They were off to New York, to their homes, their families, their businesses. But for Morgan, this journey may have been about more than just an Atlantic crossing. According to some, it was a chance to remove his greatest obstacles, to make sure his rivals never set foot in New York again. This theory suggests that Morgan knew something terrible would happen on that voyage, that he saw this tragedy as a grim opportunity. If the Titanic went down, Morgan would be rid of these three influential opponents, clearing the way for his plans for the Federal Reserve. And as the theory goes, Morgan's last-minute decision to cancel his trip was no coincidence. It was part of the plan. Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss perished in the freezing waters of the Atlantic that night. These powerful men, the ones who had the influence to counter Morgan's ambition, were now gone. And soon after, Morgan's vision of the Federal Reserve would become a reality. In 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic sank, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, creating the very institution that Morgan had pushed for, an institution that would centralize America's banking system. But what if the tragedy of the Titanic wasn't simply a tragic accident? What if it was, in fact, a cold, calculated move to clear Morgan's path to ultimate power? Of course, it's impossible to know for sure. The official story is that the Titanic hit an iceberg, that it was an unforeseen accident, a terrible twist of fate that claimed the lives of over 1,500 people. But the timing, the cancellations, the deaths of these powerful men, all of it has led some to question if this was truly just fate, or if Morgan had a hand in the disaster. We're left with a haunting question. Did J.P. Morgan orchestrate the Titanic disaster to eliminate his opponents? Was the sinking of the Titanic an accident, or a calculated move in a game of power? From financial intrigue to the supernatural, our next theory dives deep into ancient mysteries and whispers of dark curses. Was it an Egyptian mummy that doomed the Titanic? This theory is one of the strangest and most captivating surrounding the Titanic disaster. It tells of a cursed Egyptian artifact, known ominously as the unlucky mummy, believed to carry a malevolent force that brings tragedy to all who encounter it. Legend has it that this mummy was being secretly transported across the Atlantic on the Titanic, casting a shadow of misfortune over the voyage. The story begins in late 19th century England, when British museum collectors acquired a rare artifact, an ancient mummy believed to be that of an Egyptian priestess. This artifact, called the unlucky mummy, quickly gained notoriety for the strange and tragic events that followed it. The legend claims that anyone who handled, moved, or even came too close to the mummy would meet with misfortune or death. The artifact was known to have a haunting history. According to the legend, a series of mysterious and unsettling events surrounded the unlucky mummy shortly after it arrived in England. It's said that people who handled or transported the artifact began experiencing a string of accidents and tragedies. Several museum staff reported accidents, sudden illnesses, and even deaths. Curators were struck by strange misfortunes, and guards swore they could hear eerie whispers in the vicinity of the mummy. But the curse didn't end there. Some accounts claim that after British museum officials grew fearful of the mummy's supposed curse, they decided to secretly send it overseas to escape its wrath. And that's where the Titanic comes in. The story goes that the mummy was loaded aboard the Titanic in April 1912, bound for a museum in New York. Concealed in the cargo hold, this unlucky mummy was reportedly packed alongside the Titanic's other treasures. But the curse would have none of it. The theorists who support this story argue that the mummy's curse followed the Titanic from the moment it left port. There were reportedly strange occurrences on board, an eerie sense of dread among some passengers, and unexplained cold drafts in certain parts of the ship. Crew members claim to have witnessed shadows moving about below deck. The curse seemed to haunt the Titanic, trailing it like an unseen specter. And then, the disaster. The unsinkable Titanic struck an iceberg and went down, claiming the lives of over 1,500 people. Those who believe in the mummy's curse see this as its final act, the climactic expression of an ancient wrath unleashed on all who dared to cross its path. The priestess, they say, brought doom across the Atlantic, a tragic end to the ship and its passengers. Could it really be that an ancient artifact from Egypt's past held such a powerful curse? Did this unlucky mummy reach out across the centuries, dragging the Titanic into the depths of the ocean? Or is it simply a tale created to explain the unexplainable? This story, while incredible, remains shrouded in mystery. There's no official record that the mummy ever boarded the Titanic, but the legend has lived on for over a century. It offers an otherworldly explanation for a tragedy that continues to haunt us. So, we have to ask, was it really an iceberg that caused the Titanic to sink? Or an ancient curse, awakened and unleashed on the ill-fated voyage? For our final theory, we'll look at a claim that challenges everything we think we know. What if the Titanic never sank at all? This is one of the most unusual and audacious theories out there. A theory that suggests everything we know about that tragic night in 1912, the iceberg, the sinking, and the lives lost, may all be part of an elaborate cover-up. So, how could the Titanic disaster, one of the most infamous events in history, be a lie? According to this theory, the Titanic didn't sink in the cold Atlantic. Instead, the ship made a secret return to port, while a different wreck was staged on the ocean floor to deceive the world. Why would anyone do this? Let's dive into the details of this unusual theory. At the time, White Star Line was facing mounting financial pressure. The sinking of a ship as famous as the Titanic would have been catastrophic in every sense, but some theorists suggest that, under the surface, this disaster was staged not just to protect White Star Line's reputation, but to control the fallout of a struggling company. According to this theory, White Star Line orchestrated the sinking to save face, secretly guiding the Titanic back to port while presenting a fake wreck to the public. So, how would such a scheme even work? It's claimed that on that fateful night, a carefully planned route was plotted that would allow the Titanic to appear lost in the Atlantic while returning to a hidden port. Meanwhile, the theory suggests a staged wreck was placed far out at sea, ready to be discovered in the coming decades. By letting the world believe that Titanic lay at the bottom of the ocean, White Star Line could avoid accountability and ensure the disaster was viewed as an unfortunate accident rather than a fault in engineering or poor navigation. Years later, when the wreck was finally located, evidence surfaced that cast doubt on its authenticity. Explorers found that certain identification marks on the wreck were inconsistent with Titanic's design. Specifically, some argue that the identification plates found in the wreck don't seem to match the Titanic's original specifications. These inconsistencies in the structure, layout, and materials hint that the ship lying on the ocean floor may not actually be the Titanic. The wreck has also shown signs of modifications and features that don't align with the known design of the Titanic, but bear closer resemblance to other ships of that era. These subtle differences fuel the theory that the ship lying on the seafloor is, in fact, not the Titanic at all, but rather a cleverly orchestrated decoy intended to maintain the illusion. But if that's true, who would have been responsible? For theorists, the answer lies in a shadowy web of corporate and government connections. They argue that powerful figures may have collaborated to stage the wreck, keeping the true fate of the Titanic a closely guarded secret. The cover-up would have required cooperation at the highest levels, government officials, company executives, and even select members of the Titanic's crew who were supposedly sworn to secrecy. If this was indeed a planned operation, then a number of high-profile individuals would have had to be involved to make it work. This wasn't just a simple insurance fraud or financial cover-up. This would have been an operation of immense scope and planning, designed to protect White Star Line's interests and avoid a scandal that would otherwise bring down the company. But if this theory is true, if the wreck lying at the bottom of the Atlantic isn't the Titanic, then it begs the question, what happened to the real ship? Did it truly make it back to port only to be dismantled in secrecy? Or did it meet an unknown fate, hidden from the public eye to this day? This theory, while hard to believe, raises questions about the evidence we rely on to tell the Titanic story. And if the Titanic's identity was concealed, what else might history be hiding? If this story is a fabrication, then who else knew about it? Was it a government cover-up, a corporate scheme, or both? And what other secrets could lie below the surface? Each of these theories paints the Titanic disaster in a very different light. Was it a simple, heartbreaking accident? Or was it something far darker, a case of greed and fraud, a calculated power move by one of history's most powerful men, or even a curse born from ancient Egypt? Each theory adds a new layer of intrigue, a different lens through which to see one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. The Titanic story is as mysterious as it is tragic. For over a century, this ship has captured our imaginations, and perhaps part of its power lies in the questions it leaves unanswered. Was it truly the iceberg that brought down the unsinkable ship? Or could there be more to this story, hidden truths that have yet to come to light? So what do you think? Was the Titanic a victim of an unfortunate accident? Or was there something more? An iceberg, yes, but also secrets buried in the Atlantic. Let us know in the comments what you believe happened on that fateful night. We'd love to hear your theories, and who knows, maybe the truth is still out there, waiting to be discovered.